Okay, so this is our Economics 201-7B midterm review, and it is going to basically be a review of all of the uh, quizzes, multiple choice quizzes that we've taken. So, multiple choice and true and false, so, a couple other little things here and there. So, move out of macroeconomics, John Maynard Keynes. Why did he find it? To solve the problem of persistent unemployment, which there was in the 1930s. There was massive unemployment. Free markets weren't working all of a sudden. What was wrong? So Keynes said we need a government intervention, and has left a legacy in macroeconomics of perpetual debate about whether government should be in the economy or not, and if so, how much. Okay, so yeah, the free market miracle, as it were, so-called free market miracle has become very dominant, but it doesn't change the fact that, as Khan from Khan uh, Academy pointed out, if there is massive unemployment or recession causing it, governments are almost immediately going to start engaging in deficit spending to try to fix it. Margaret Thatcher is a rare exception to that. She managed to turn unemployment around without government government deficit. Okay. Yeah. I mean, the textbook answer here is the amount of real dollars rising annually, but the best way to look at it is just looking around you. Comparing it to how it was in the past, which I realize for some of you that there may not be that much difference at this point, but it's really good to kind of understand this visually. Numbers don't really mean too much. Yeah, since the end of the Cold War in particular, it started in the 1970s. There started being a lot of push. Keynes, at the kind of government interventionist idea had kind of come to an apogee under Lyndon B. Johnson. They said, "Wow, we can deficit spend, and not even just solve unemployment, but more." Um, they don't acknowledge it. That's since become kind of modern monetary theory that governments can actually, spend to finance programs that we may want. But after the Cold War ended, yeah, I mean that pushback had reached an apogee because it was kind of felt like, wow, the West won, free markets won, even though they hadn't been entirely free market. Uh, so microeconomics, which is here's really the real difference between micro and macroeconomics. Microeconomics is kind of the free market idea, although ironically it doesn't really suggest that in practice, but it's interpreted that way. And macroeconomics is the government invention idea. So they're kind of actually at odds with each other, with each other. Other than microeconomics, as I'm saying here, is kind of taken over macroeconomics. So they're a lot more similar, which is why we spent 4 weeks and have yet to really cover any macroeconomics at all in the class. I feel the trade stuff is macroeconomics. It is kind of micro and macro. So in that sense, that's macro. Production possibilities frontier. It's in micro, but it's really macro. So we kind of got to start with that. Okay, so opportunity cost. This is not something that's very important to macroeconomics. It's in there for micro. Uh, there's a lot of problems with this. The way they define it, it's like the next best opportunity, but that doesn't really help you very much because that if it's the next best opportunity, then you're already doing the best thing you can. You don't really need to know what the opportunity cost is. That's what I mean when I say it's a heuristic device. It's only there to help you find the best opportunity. Uh, it gets used more broadly in effect, just meaning what is the cost of uh, something else you could be doing instead, but it's really only important if it's greater than what you're doing, which is not in the way it's defined as the next best opportunity, depending on what kind of word usage you want to use. Okay, but it's not a real cost. It's just for making decisions. That's the only reason it's there. Okay, Pareto efficiency is not the best measure of efficiency because if you have two different possibilities that you are considering, two different policies or programs are sometimes called, you cannot know from Pareto efficiency which is best. Pareto efficiency is only useful if you're evaluating one program, whether it is efficient or not. It's also free lunching, in microeconomics, like the kind of, watchword is, its logo is like there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, that is free lunching. It makes everybody better off and nobody worse off with no cost. That's not economics. So if you had two programs and one, and remember, Pareto efficiency is not is a point where you can't make anybody else better off without making somebody else worse off. It sounds nice, but in reality, what that means is that if there is a program with a very small benefit as opposed to a program with an extremely high benefit and a very small cost, then the second will be rejected because it's not Pareto efficient. That's why I say it doesn't measure efficiency. It's not actually measuring what the best program is. Okay, it's just telling you if you have this essentially impossible program, you know, everybody wins, then you know you should do it as opposed to not doing it. Okay, you know, so match the left-hand column to the right-hand column. Hedonic philosophy, the word hedonism, same thing. This is assumed in economics. People are only interested in maximizing their benefit and reducing their, uh, maximizing pleasure, reducing pain. Platonic forms. Yes, economic models are not supposed to be in this world per se. They're off. They're basically Plato, the philosopher who followed Socrates, believed that everything had a perfect form, like a horse. There'd be this perfect horse off in this kind of Platonic heaven. And then what we get in the real world are sort of like degraded forms of that. Same thing with economic models. They're sort of off perfectly in this perfect world, if they're done right. And but the reality of them is distorted as it comes into the real world. Okay, via negativia, a lot of times in economics, we know what is by knowing what is not. A good example is when we have an equilibrium, we know it's not efficient to not have one uh, to the left of it because it's not good enough, and to the right of it, we know it's not efficient because we're getting worse and worse as we depart from that equilibrium. And because the only other two possibilities are wrong, we know that the equilibrium is the most efficient point. Other things equal. Aristotelian logic, syllogistic logic, it's central to economic theory. It's always based on Aristotelian logic. It's supposed to be anyhow. Uh, that's what people criticize in economic theory if it's done in the best way. They look at how it's internally inconsistent, it's called, meaning that it's not logical. Okay, yep, Adam Smith, right, specialization. If people all specialize in one job, there's less transition costs between jobs, less training they need, so it's more efficient. That's the argument anyhow. Right, I already explained this about Pareto efficiency. That statement is true. Right, it's kind of a repeat of this question. It added this Socratic elicitation. Have not been able to do much of that. It's a lot that the first extra credit quiz was, but there's not that many great ways to do Socratic elicitation in an asynchronous class like this. I'd do it more if it were in real life. Okay, this is false. The most efficient distribution is if everything's entirely fair. If there are two agents, One is a billionaire getting their fifth yacht. The other is about to die of a deadly disease. What Chiang is going to tell us is that it's actually inefficient to make the resources used for the yacht to be used instead to save the life, because it's not Pareto efficient. It makes somebody better off by making somebody else worse off. The reality is, obviously, the cost to somebody losing their life is much higher than denying the billionaire his fifth yacht, excuse me. So that's fair to transfer the wealth from the billionaire to the person who's dying, but it's also efficient because the billionaire is paying a much smaller cost than the person dying is. And when we talk about efficiency, we're talking about everybody in society, in this case, those two agents, together being as best off as possible. And because the utility gain to the dying man from getting the transfer from the billionaire is, the money from the billionaire, the resources. That's how we ultimately should think of it. And the billionaire is not made anywhere near as bad off as the good given to the dying person. It is more efficient to make that transfer from the billionaire to the dying person. Okay, this whole positive normative thing, I'm going to give you a little hint. I think maybe one of you got this. If it has the word should in it, it's normative. If it doesn't, it doesn't. An opinion is not normative. It's not a difference between a fact and an opinion. It's a difference between a statement about what should be and a statement about what is. Okay, so the fact that, The Shield is my favorite TV show, you could call that a fact. It's an opinion, but that gets a little confusing. But it's an opinion. It's not a statement about what should be. If I said everybody should watch The Shield, that's a normative statement. Or if I tell someone you should watch The Shield, that's a normative statement. If I say The Shield is my favorite TV show, that's a positive statement. Okay, so just look for that word should or ought to, maybe. That if it has either of those in there, then it's a normative statement. Okay, yeah, I told you the real difference between micro and macro. This is sort of what the book says. It's kind of a way microeconomics has taken the government involvement aspect out of it by just talking about it's what we're looking at. That's not untrue. I mean, those are all characteristics of macroeconomics, but it is not centrally what it is. Okay, last one here. So I've already kind of had a lecture about comparative advantage, and I am not going to go into a lot of details about it here. The one thing I really want you to understand is that this is very confusing, because if it's absolute advantage, that means that one of the agents can do something better than the other can, and vice versa. Okay, if it's comparative advantage, one agent or one of the players can do better at both things than the other. So that sounds like it's absolute. Like, this country can do both better than the other. So they must have an absolute advantage. But it's not that. It's the opposite. A way to deal with this may be to say, if it kind of feels like it's absolute, it's not. It's comparative, because absolute means that that one is not better at both. If one is better at both, then you're in a comparative advantage. It's that simple. I told you a way to do it graphically in the PowerPoint lecture. So in this case here, because Jacqueline's better at both, then it's comparative advantage. Okay, so the difference between change in supply and change in demand is really simple. If it has a change in price of the good in question, then it is a change in quantity demanded. Okay, if it's a change in something else that would change the amount of that product that would be demanded at any price, then it's a change in demand. But how you know the difference? If it's price for the good in question, then it is quantity demanded. If it's not, and it affects demand, then it's demand. Same with supply. If it's something about the price and it's a change in quantity supplied, if that's driving it, the price of the good in question. Okay. If it's something that's not the price of the good in question, then it's change in supply. If it is something that changes supply. So something to look out here for here, though, if it is that if it changes the price of the thing in question, it's change in demand. If it changes the price of something else, excuse me, if it changes the price of, if there is a, okay, just scrap what I just said. If there is a price change in the good in question, it changes quantity demanded or supplied. If there is a price change in something that is not the good in question, then it can change supply or demand. Okay, so you got to look out for that. Price change of the good in question, quantity. Price change of something else, if it affects it, then it's, if it affects the good in question, then it's a change in demand or a change in supply. Okay, with this one here, um, when I originally asked it, there'd been some mistakes in it, so I had to kind of give you all credit for it, but you still should really know how to do this. I think a couple of you got it anyhow. So, there's going to be questions you get from time to time that just aren't like something that are, the answer is in the book. You just need to change a couple things around. You have to, understand the concepts and be able to think them through. So, in this case, because the price of cream and the price of milk are the same, then if the price of milk goes up, then her demand for coffee doesn't change because there's a substitute that's just as good at the same price that was there before that she can use for her coffee. Okay, so nothing happens there if the price of milk goes up in this situation. Okay, so if the price of milk, excuse me, if the price of cream goes up, she's going to demand more milk because it's just as good as the cream in her coffee, but it's cheaper. Okay, inferior good, got to know what that means. If income goes up, then if the good is inferior, meaning it's something that's pretty much meets the same need as something else, if they're very substitutable, except for one's an inferior version and the other's superior, then a rise in income will cause the demand for the inferior good to go down because that the agent has the money, they'd rather get the good stuff. So that's why when you know a lot of times it'll be food because they meet the same niche. It doesn't have to be though. There's other things often that it doesn't matter. But the other stuff's more brand related, and we kind of don't really want to be using brands in these comparisons. So that's why if they're not brand related, they're usually going to be food related. I mean, you might say a luxury car is, or rather a non-luxury car is like an inferior good, and if you're, and because you get a luxury car if you get wealthier, and I hope you all do. Other things equal. Okay. So, you can be usually pretty sure that if the good in question, has experienced some kind of natural, its production, some kind of a natural catastrophe, there's going to be less of it. It's not the price of the good that's causing the change. So it is a decrease in supply. And if there is a decrease in supply, then, the world is going to be consuming less coffee, markets notwithstanding. So it kind of transcends being just a market issue. There's just less coffee to consume in a supply shock. Economics actually has a lot of trouble dealing with supply shocks because there's just less. Um, Something we will probably talk about when we get to inflation, if we do. Okay, so this threw a lot of you, and I know why it threw a lot of you because Chiang did not list the weather or traffic from a nearby football game in the determinants of demand. However, these things reduce the number of consumers, the number of buyers who will go to market. So that's fewer buyers, and Xiang does tell you that. So you kind of got to think outside of the box here. If there's bad weather, let me put it, if with the first one, if there's bad weather, it'll do that. If there's bad weather, fewer people go, fewer buyers. If there is heavy traffic, fewer buyers. You really got to do that in economics. It's all about analytical skills. You got to think if this does that, then that does this, and this does that, and so forth. Okay, and also, you know, if so, those two things do affect demand. The question is, what would not? Now, D, the price is going down for goods at the open air market, so the change in quantity demanded is going up, not demand. More sellers entering the market is a change in supply, not demand. Almost everybody got this. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, a lot of economics does not get this. It's a central issue to the misunderstanding of value that is prevalent and has been for a couple hundred years now. Price is not equal to value. Price is always other things equal. I should say it's not equal to value, other things equal. It's always less than value, other things equal. The reason for that is quite simple. Both parties in the exchange are getting more than they did without the exchange. So value is increased by the exchange greater than the price that they're paying, because the price that they are paying is less than the value of exchange. Otherwise, they wouldn't be exchanging it. Okay, I actually had made a mistake in D here. C and D were, or depending on how you look at it, uh, well, D was written incorrectly, and I wanted C to be a little bit different. So y'all got a point on this one, no matter if you took the quiz at all. And so, looking at the corrected answers, if the price of good A decreases, then the quantity demanded of A decreases and the price of B increases. So, sorry, I was wrong. Okay, so because no, C is wrong, so my mistake. So let's look at D. Let's start with B, right? The quantity demanded of A increases because the price decreased, right? Pretty straightforward. Need a comma in there. Uh, the quantity demanded of B decreases because the price went up. So B is correct. Now D is also correct because the price went down for A, so the quantity of it demanded increases. The price went up for, the price went down for A. The other effect of that is that because B is a substitute for it, then the demand for B decreases. So, yeah. So here, whether it's neutral or indeterminate, what happens with a change in demand, we can generally, but not always, say that a decrease in supply is always bad and an increase always good. Simply put, if there's a decrease in supply, the world has less. You can also look at it by saying, well, the price went up, the amount went down. That's bad. Whereas and if supply increases, then the world has more of it. So that's a good thing, and that's reflected on the markets by the price decreasing and there being more of it that's exchanged. With demand, there's always going to be a change in price and quantity in the opposite direction. So it's harder to say whether it's good or bad. And essentially we can look at it as other things equal, neutral. Okay. Tricky question here. I think a couple of you, at least one of you, got this. So if the price of lemons goes up because it's a complement to tea, then effectively, you know, the price of tea has gone up because he's getting tea with lemons. So if he has tea with lemons, then an increase in the price of lemons means the tea with lemons is more expensive. So then he switched to uh, coffee and whatever he's drinking with it because it is relatively less expensive, the coffee with milk, than the tea with lemons. Okay, so now we're moving on to quiz 3 is chapter 4. It's, almost none of you had trouble with these two of those who took the quiz, obviously, uh, which I guess is tautology. So yeah, you know, the willingness to pay is the amount that a consumer is willing to pay for a good, the most they're willing to pay for a good. If that amount is above what they pay, then they get that consumer surplus or welfare benefit. So, all you had to do is take the price and subtract it from each of the consumer's willingness to pay, add that up, and that is their consumer surplus. With a restaurant, their willingness to, I think Chiang uses the term willingness to sell. In that context, willingness to accept is the same thing. There are other contexts where willingness to accept would mean something different, but basically, willingness to sell is a form of a willingness to accept. So, same thing, just in reverse. You just take the amount that was paid for every good because that's a benefit to the restaurant, and then to subtract their willingness to sell, which is their cost, and sum that up, and you get the producer surplus. Add producer and consumer surplus together, by the way, you get total welfare. Okay, this was a problem for almost everyone. I don't know if anyone got this right. I did give you credit and change the wording of the question to make the question a little more clear, but I still feel like, I was kind of, it's kind of a favor for you there because you still probably should have been able to get it right. But I don't know what the problem is with this question. It's like the amount, if you add up the producer surplus or the welfare of all the friends, compared to the amount if you add up all the producer surplus and the welfare of the restaurant, is greater for the friends. So they made off better there. Yeah, economics at this point almost entirely, with some exception, just says whatever the heck it wants to say for its own reasons because it wants to express their opinion. And it's basically, in effect, it's making a normative statement about how the world should be. And they're trying to support that with evidence that is based almost entirely on evidence that can be manufactured simply by changing the assumptions of the model that you're making or the level of specificity that you want. Okay, so, this is not an objective science. It's just they are selling their ideology. It's propaganda, for free markets. It's not that there's not truth in their analysis. It's just that they can manipulate the heck out of it if they want to get a certain conclusion. One of the perhaps more egregious ways they do that is, again, with this trade-off between equality and efficiency. They just assume Pareto efficiency, which is ludicrous, and then go and tell you that equality and efficiency have a trade-off because of it. The foundational utilitarian theory, which makes sense, economics approximates, we can say that all consumers have the same utility function of income. They get the same good out of it, and that it declines. We can say that reasonably, at least as an approximation. As it increases, it declines in value per unit as the amount increases. If you do that, then guess what? You get an equality and efficiency perfect consistency. What is equal is perfectly efficient. If we distribute income equally, that is a perfectly efficient distribution. And distributive efficiency is central to microeconomics because it's in a time static equilibrium. So we're not talking about growth or incentives or anything like that. We're just talking about how resources are distributed. So get this, if it's a maximally efficient distribution, then it is also an equal distribution. Probably a better way to put that would be to say it if it is a perfectly equal distribution of income, it's perfectly efficient. So there is fundamentally, centrally, and foundationally a consistency between equality and efficiency. They're just making up this ludicrous, insane form of efficiency to create this lie that there's some difference. So when Chiang tells you that, it's just ignore it. It's not true. You know, at least not in terms of microeconomics, and that's perspective. He's coming from there. Yeah, chapter 1 through 4 are all stuff you're going to get in microeconomics, or most of it at least. He may touch on some quote macro unquote issue at times. Okay, so anthropogenic global climate change is all of these things. I'll quickly go over them. So let's say that you steal $5. No, actually, in the television show Better Call Saul, there's even better example. This is actually what it's like. Um, One of the characters in the show steals a newspaper from his neighbor's doorstep and puts $5 there. And the police tell, the woman whose newspaper it was calls the police and they come and arrest him. Because, who's to say what the value of the newspaper was to her? He can't arbitrarily decide that. Now, in global climate change, they do that. They say, well, we don't know what the value of global climate change will be to the future, but they just decide. I don't do that. Well, that's not actually true, but they just decide that this is how much it's going to hurt the future, and we need to compensate them that much. Okay, that's what most economists do, anyhow. And then they discount that because it's in the future, which is a complex issue that is kind of central to my dissertation. So I could go on and about that. But the point being, okay, even though it's like that character in Better Call Saul stealing the newspaper, like paying for something that we don't know what the value of is, so that makes no sense in itself, even if we were to accept that for the sake of argument, which I'm essentially doing in my dissertation. I probably should make a comment about this, as I've been going to. Even if we assumed that, then what's happening is we're creating a negative market externality by global climate change. Because every time you put gas in your car or truck, or buy something that's made that releases CO2 EQ, we're harming future generations. In many cases, essentially infinitely, which would be hard to compensate, right? But for complex reasons, there may be some validity to making that finite. But the point being, we're paying them back for that. So that's why it's a negative market externality. Let's skip down to D here because that kind of more relates to this. Let's say that I stole a newspaper from you and didn't pay you anything for it. And you take me to court and you say, well, you owe me for that newspaper. And I say, no. If I gave you that $5 back for the newspaper, then I am doing you this public good. I'm doing you this private good, but I'm doing you this good that you are not paying for. So I'm not going to give you the $5. That's what Chiang's saying here. We're creating global climate change that's damaging other nations and future generations, and then saying, well, we don't have to pay them back because that's a public good or a positive market externality. We're just doing good for them and they're not paying for it. We're paying the cost, but despite the fact that we owe it to them. That's the fundamental reason I'm telling you this argument of Chiang's is crazy. And it blames the victims for the costs. It's also like with the tragedy of the commons, what that means is that there's no property rights. So any common ground, people will just go, like the example is usually like a pasture, and they'd have sheep grazing in the pasture until it was destroyed, because there was no there's no cost to destroying that property. That's what we're doing with anthropogenic global climate change. We have this commons, which is a healthy environment of the earth, and everyone's just going and destroying it because they don't have to pay the cost to do so. So in this case, individual utility maximization does not lead to the common good, as it's supposed to in economics, unless it is a negative market externality, which anthropogenic global climate change is, which means that the cost to society, the social costs, or the social cost, has to be paid by the perpetrators. Um, yeah, and that's an example of some of the many ways that economists flout reason in order to say, hey, we don't have to do anything about anthropogenic global climate change, or very little. Uh, it's just doing something that's like completely unreasonable, and then and doing that so we can just keep on going with the status quo. Okay, so let's talk about something different. Uh, so, do you remember when I was telling you that Pareto efficiency was a sort of ludicrous definition of efficiency that allows them to basically say that things that are indeed efficient, because they're against the status quo and free markets and the philosophy that they're operating under, is inefficient? Well, guess what? I mean, that Pareto efficiency is sort of motored by ordinal utility, which means we can't say if one person's better off than another person. So we don't know if the the billionaire losing the yacht would be worse off than, you know, would be not as bad off as the poor person, the sick person whose life we're saving. So we can't really say if it's more efficient to transfer that yacht. That's how they get Pareto efficiency. There's no way to say, so we only know if everybody's better off, that it's better for sure. Even though if it's not Pareto efficient, it's not that it's not efficient. Even under that definition, it means that we don't know whether it's efficient or not, and they're just calling that inefficient, which is just like completely effed up. And then, as if it weren't bad enough, when they start talking about these, disequilibrium positions in the market that they usually bring up, it's coming from government, because it's an argument against government in the economy. See above, macroeconomics, microeconomics. Then they actually change it. It's not ordinal utility anymore. Now we can compare the welfare of agents. That's the only way you can make the statement that there is a loss of welfare from restrictions on trade, from price floors, from price ceilings. You have to have cardinal utility. So here we go. This is what I'm talking about. Here we go again. They're changing the assumptions of the model in order to get the conclusions they want. Okay, so it's not only cardinal utility you have to assume to make these statements. You'd also have to assume that incomes are equal and that prices are stable. The reason that long run thing is there is that because in microeconomics, if there are constant costs, sort of the baseline assumption about the long run is that prices are stable. And no matter what changes, whatever in markets, there'll be a change in quantity, but there will not be a change in price in the long run. Okay, moving on. So if we do assume all of this stuff operating in the model based on its contradictory, its assumptions that are contradictory to other models where they're trying to just arrange everything so they can get this point that free markets are without government institutions, against basic macroeconomics, at least in some situations, fundamentally depression or recession, unemployment. In any event, if we do make all of these assumptions, no matter how contrary they were to the previous ones, then the argument is that when markets are not in equilibrium, producers and consumer surplus are less, added together, which is called welfare, and there's this dead weight loss, and all the dead weight loss means is that welfare is less when markets aren't in equilibrium. And that stems from the fact that if we're to the left of the equilibrium, we're not as good off as we could be. And if we're to the right of it, which other forms of market disequilibrium will lead us to, like anthropogenic global climate change, then we are worse off than we could have been. Okay, the reason people won't get as much is right. I guess that would be right in terms of utility, but in terms of actual consumption, people will actually substitute, go to other markets for other goods they don't want as much. So you'll get the same amount for their income, but they won't get as much welfare. I don't really like that. I'm gonna have to give you guys points for this question. I don't think any of you got it. Too many of you got it wrong though. But if you did, I'll give you credit for it because that people won't get as much. They won't get as much welfare. It doesn't. Technology is a supply issue. This is a market equilibrium issue, so it's not gonna directly affect technological innovation. Uh, it does not create a positive market externality when this happens. When it's at equilibrium, it's more like a negative market externality at least. But I think for a B, it should say people won't get as much stuff. Um, so the shark fin question. What's really of interest in this question is as horrible as you know shark fin hunters are, or at least as horrible as the effect of their hunting is, and consumption, which drives the production of shark fins. I remember in China they had an ad with Yao Ming telling people not to eat shark fins. I I tried to tell when we were all after some training deciding where to go to dinner. I was like trying to tell everyone not to go to this restaurant because they sure served the shark fin. I ended up not joining them. However, this is no different than anthropogenic global climate change. Okay, shark fin market. People go, they pay a price, but the price they're paying is not the actual cost to society, the result of that price that they're paying, because there's this other cost to it in terms of destruction of anthropogenic global climate change. Same exact thing with the shark fins. People go, they pay for their shark fin soup, and the amount they're paying, the cost to them, assuming the price is the same as cost, is, well, it's not. That's the whole point. It's not the same as cost. So the cost, well, assuming the cost to them is the same as price, then the cost to them is not the cost of the shark fin, because it's harming people who like sharks. It's harming people. It's harming who like ecosystems being sound. It's harming the ecosystems in which we live, which can impact fish populations and so forth. May impact the availability of other goods. Um, so it has this cost that's not on the market. Well, guess what? Anthropogenic global climate change is the same thing. It has this cost, a much bigger one, by the way. That's not to minimize shark fin exploitation, but anthropogenic global climate change has this huge cost. It's not on the market, so it's exactly like the shark fin market. But when we're talking about that, Chiang goes on to say, well, it's not, like removing it is not, at least not just removing a negative market externality, is creating this positive externality, which is crazy for the reasons I've already said. But what's even more crazy is he doesn't say that about the shark fin thing, because it's not true about the shark fin thing. He describes the shark fin market as creating the social cost that's not on the market, which is exactly the same thing without qualification as anthropogenic global climate change. But when we get to anthropogenic global climate change, all of a sudden his story changes, even though anthropogenic global climate change is far worse. That's another example of this kind of craziness that they get into that I was talking about with this. Another thing here, one of you put this. That's kind of cute. The welfare of the sharks is not being taken into consideration. That actually may be critique. That's not what Chiang is saying. There's a reason for that. in economics, only human beings have welfare. Nothing else does. Now, is that a positive or a normative statement? Well, that in itself is a positive statement, but it comes from the normative statement that you need in order to make that positive statement, that only human beings should matter in the equation. Is there any logical reason for that? No. Completely an arbitrary assertion, you know. So the only reason that this is not part of what Chiang said with the shark's welfare is because, well, he didn't say that, and the reason for that is because economists only consider human welfare. Now, that doesn't mean that sharks don't matter, as was implicit in my explanation of the social cost of shark fins being greater than the market cost. Um, it was implied that sharks matter to people. So animals, plants, anything like this that might have uh, otherwise have standing does not in itself, but they do have standing in terms of what they mean to humans. You love your pet, so if something happens to your pet, that affects your mood. So the pet doesn't have standing, but you have standing, and the effect of the pet on your mood is an economic consideration, and hence the shark fin and the anthropogenic global climate change uh, being considered economic issues. Okay, this last one, almost nobody wrote much about this. I think one or two of you did a little, um, which I didn't want more than a little, but a lot of you, a couple of you didn't answer it. I got like one sentence. I think two of you fleshed something out a little. It was more about the con. I mean, a couple of them were good, a few of them, but we get into this sort of problem in economics that's never come up with a really great solution for. I mean, if we're a democracy, then what society is expressing through the voting process is their preferences. So, to say that, well, government shouldn't interfere, well, what if people want them to interfere? Then that's their preferences. So why would that be a bad thing? It's just preferences as much on the market. Now, one thing I think AI spit out is like, when I was looking into it, it's like, well, market rationality isn't the same as, voter rationality. See the most recent elections. Just kidding. Um, however, well, so then why would humans be market rational but not, politically rational? There's no reason to assume one if not the other. If we're going to assume that they're rational in the market, as economics does, then we have to assume they're rational voting as well, and then that their voting preferences reflect their choice and is efficient. Okay, so that's a problem with kind of knocking on, throwing stones at government here in a democracy, as it were. Now, we could talk about imperfections in the political process or something like that, but still, as the underlying assumption, in a government that is supposed to be chosen by its citizens, by the public, then you really can't say that government activity is bad. And so it's another problem with this anti-government argument that economists, the mainstream ones at least are largely so in love with. Okay, so now we're going to get into this, comparative advantage thing. I mean, a couple other things in quiz 4, and I've reviewed a little bit, 3 too, because there's some problems with that. So, okay. So yeah, most of you didn't get this either. I feel like if I'm saying something against the mainstream, you guys have trouble with those questions for some reason. So I'm not going to read the question here. I'll let you kind of read it. Okay, so in order to show that it's best for countries to engage in their comparative advantage, you have to rig the examples. Compare, because you have to compare it to what they were doing before comparative advantage. And in many cases, uh, where if countries were to utilize their comparative advantage, there's going to be the same. There's going to be less of one good and more of another. So without a utility theory of value, or without knowing what each agent's utility is, then you know there's no real way to know whether the world's better or worse off. Okay, now to be clear, with free trade, other things being equal, and there's a lot of those, you know, uh, countries cannot be made worse off because, assuming that they're acting as a whole, they don't have to engage in free trade. So, the fact that it's free, that there's no restrictions on it, means that, you know, it can't hurt them if they're being rational. Now, the problem is, in reality, countries are made up of a whole bunch of different people, so a country's policy, can definitely have some winners or losers. And, you know, if we assume that voters are not rational, it, you know, it, it may even have higher costs and benefits. It's hard to say, you know. A lot more Walmarts than there used to be around. A lot of cheap stuff. It's funny. When I was in China, um, there's like this English competition, and one of the questions was, which do you think is influencing the world more? Influencing the world more in terms of Chinese culture, influencing it, like the Confucian institutes that are springing up around the world, sharing Chinese culture, or all the stuff that we're pouring into the rest of the world. So this girl says all the stuff they're pouring into the rest of the world. That's the way a Chinese person might answer the question. Most Westerners probably wouldn't, but she may be right, because look at all the Chinese stuff that's coming into the world, and we're basically entering to a similar political system as China after the last election. So she could have been onto something there. So anyhow, yeah, I mean, free trade. If we assume that the agents themselves are doing what's best for them, that they're rational as entities, then free trade cannot make a country worse off because they don't have to engage in it. The point here is that if you use the theory of comparative advantage, uh, and you compare it to how it was without, with free trade, then you cannot show reasonably that each country engaging in its comparative advantage is best, and it may not be. Okay, so what economists do when they're writing these textbooks, I've never seen an exception to this, is they just rig the example as I showed you in the PowerPoint presentation, so that it's like with autarky before free trade, the world consumed, this quantity X and this quantity Y. And then after free trade, well, they consume more of X and more of Y, or the same amount of X and the same amount of Y. You can say, oh, look, it's better off from comparative advantage. But the reality is there's a lot of circumstances where countries engage in comparative advantage in which, there'll be less of one good and more of another good. And you can't just say from that, oh, look, the world's better off because of comparative advantage. So they rig the examples to try to convince you of the wonders of comparative advantage. Okay, this next one here, you really had to watch the lectures, you know, the lecture on this. I think it was part two of the two-part lectures. To get this, it's kind of a tough question. Chiang covers this. He does it a little bit different way. I think, basically the main difference is this word savings. Chiang does not use that word. I admit it's a more advanced word in economics, social savings, but it's getting more capital, whatever you want to call it. Complete increasing the capital stock, capital deepening, whatever. And by the way, I spell capital, the capital K, to distinguish it from financial capital, which is at this point at least an unusual spelling. I've actually done it in the paper I did. So in any event, a change in social savings. If people save more in economics socially, that means that they produce capital instead of goods. Now, there's a time to produce. In that time, you could produce capital or you could produce goods. And there's those resources in that time that you have. If you produce capital, you're saving because you're producing something that you cannot consume right away, but you can consume more in the next period if you have more capital. I like to think of it as, you're making machines instead of consumer goods. So it's like you kind of think about that. You have more machines in the next period. I mean, above depreciation, above what's disappearing, then you're going to have more goods in the next period, and that's pretty much exactly why, at least in theory, I think there's a lot of truth to it. When you put money in a savings account, you get more because you're basically the bank. When you put money in an account, it loans your money to investment projects. They use that money to borrow and make machines in this period instead of consumption. That's why when you put 10 out of $100 that you've earned in a bank account, you're choosing to consume $10 less. You're actually saving by telling society that you want savings goods, which are capital, instead of consumption goods. So there's that consistency. When you're putting money in a savings account, in theory, it leads to firms having money to borrow so that they can make machines so that in the next period they have more and then they can pay you back more, hence the interest payment. So when society does that, and this is intertemporal, remember, Chiang doesn't mention that, but that's not really a fault. He's just trying to make it simpler right now. Then, and then, when they invest in more capital, then the production possibility frontier pops out, goes outward because society has more machines, so it can produce more now than it could in the period before. Same with technology. The change in technology, we can produce more because machines are going to be more efficient. They're going to produce more, and more productive, which is kind of two sides of the same coin. They're going to be able to use less to produce more. I guess productive would be the better term than efficient because they're actually using the same amount to produce more. So with the change in technology, society's more productive. They can push out the production possibilities frontier. In foreign investment, more capital pushes out the production possibilities frontier. Okay, a change in taste and our preferences in both societies does not push out the production possibilities frontier. The production possibilities frontier is about how much we can produce, not what we want to produce. Taste and preferences affect how much what affects how much we choose to produce of what we can produce. All right, so we could have more rockets at the expense of cars, or more cars at the expense of rockets, and taste and preferences will choose that. Will determine that mix, but it does not mean that we can produce more. And as a sort of a little footnote to this, at one point Chiang says, "Well, we don't really know, in any kind of a definitive way what people will want, where on the production possibility curve they'll want to produce." It's kind of a silly statement because there is a technique in economics where we can have a consumer indifference curve, which is like the same thing but like flipped in the opposite direction, and where that touches the production possibilities curve, that is where people want to produce. And it's like, it's not any more unreasonable to assume that really than a lot of things that economists assume. It's just an approximation, at least as a theoretical tool. In fact, I had a critique by a professor who said, when I was using that you can't do that, but that I actually showed him that that's actually an established technique. Okay, dangers of the comparative advantage argument. Okay, this is something a lot of you missed. At least a couple of you did. When wealthy countries trade with poorer countries, other things equal, it's good for them. Okay, it's bad for the home country. Other than prices go up in the poorer country and they go down in the home country, but they are getting a lot more resources in. So the fact that prices go up in the foreign country doesn't really matter because they have they have a lot more resources that they're consuming, and the fact that prices go down in the rich country, is helpful, but it's at the cost of a lot of employment. So it's kind of like, are they actually better off as a result? I understand in Europe, prices are higher, but wages are also higher. In the United States, prices are lower and wages are lower. Which is better? You know, we'd all like to live in Europe if we could, right? Okay. Yeah, that's not a critique. If the production were green, um, then the comparative advantage theory wouldn't have any problems because free trade would be good as it's actually practiced because capital labor can't move. We don't have this problem of capital traveling from wealthy countries to poor countries and labor traveling from poor countries to wealthy countries, lowering the wage of the home country. Okay, so number C, excuse me, letter C here is not really a free trade critique. It's just that they're not telling you, and arguably it doesn't matter that much, that comparative advantage um, will always be advantageous. Like every country should always engage in their comparative advantage. That's not true. There'll be mixes in how much they produce. It'll be better for them to produce some at home in a lot of cases and export some abroad. Sort of what I was talking about with the rigged examples. D. Um, so yeah, that's it. It kind of says it all right. 90% of GDP is indoors, which means most of it's capital intensive, and that means that comparative advantage isn't going to be the issue. When there's free trade, capital leaving the country is going to be the issue, which enriches for poor countries. I mean, the reason that, and this is in another question, I think, that UN poverty targets, ending poverty targets were meant like 5 or 6 years before schedule, which is rare. It's all from this free trade stuff. Wealth is basically transferring from rich countries to poor countries. I think it was in like the chapter three lecture. No, it wouldn't have been the chapter three lecture. In the capital mobility lecture, I was talking about. I explained this. Okay, almost everybody got this wrong. I think one student got this right. Again, super simple, guys and gals. I said it's confusing. I think what confuses people is this word. I mean, it confuses me. Absolute. If one country is dominant, as it were, and can produce both goods better, then it's comparative advantage. It's not absolute advantage. You can, if you're still confused, you can just chart this out. Put like one good on one axis, another good on the other. How much each country can produce. Connect a line between them for both countries. If those lines cross, then it's absolute advantage. If the lines are parallel, or not, they don't have to be parallel. Excuse me, but if they don't cross, okay, then it's excuse me, did I get that wrong? If the lines cross, then I think I said that right. It's absolute advantage. If they don't cross, then it's comparative advantage. Okay, so do it that way, or if you can, in your mind at least, although you have a lot of time for these quizzes, so I don't see any reason not to if you're even a little confused. But you can also do it by looking at each one and say, oh, the Congo can produce 10 million carats of diamonds. China can produce less. Okay, so the Congo is better at producing diamonds. Well, what about China? Oh, it can produce cars better than the Congo can. Okay, well, it can do that better. So if both have an advantage, an absolute advantage, that's where the term comes from, one than the other, then it's absolute advantage. This is the only one, C, where one country, the United States, in this example, and by the way, these are all fictionalized. I sometimes I'll do a little research and try to get an estimate, but this is not to be relied on as factual. These quantities of production for these countries, they can produce more cars than can Japan, and they can produce more flat screen TVs than can Japan. Both, bam, comparative advantage. Okay, that's it. Okay, I just tried to ask you a similar question because we had so much trouble with it before. as the open air market question. This is kind of in reverse. It's the online question. So, right, the weather is bad. People are less likely to shop outdoors or more likely to shop at home. Other things equal, that means there's more online buyers. Um, so that increases, that changes demand for the online shopping. Same with traffic. It's like in reverse. If there's traffic, people want to go to the brick and mortar stores and want to shop at home. Increase in internet speed, easier to shop at home, increases demand for shopping at home. More people come and shop online. Uh, so right, if a price in the online stores falls, then that's a change in quantity demanded. In the online stores, not a change in demand. More brick and mortar stores opening, that's supply. It's more sellers. That does not a change in demand. It'll change the quantity demanded, but we're not worrying about that at this point, at least. I mean, we're not going to in this class any further. It's just change the number of sellers, change in supply, not demand. A pandemic keeps people at home. That's a pretty easy one. They're going to shop more at online stores, and we all know that increases demand for online stores. If there is a new policy of returns for in online stores that's favorable to customers, that reduces the cost of online shopping. So increase the demand for online goods. Okay, this is in my first lecture. Allocative efficiency is reduced when there's CO2 EQ emissions, at least unless it's corrected. And by the way, how is it corrected? Well, there's two ways that they generally think to do it. One is a little more direct towards uh, the actually forget that. Basically, there's two ways they do it. Like they can do it with a tax, or they can sell rights to pollute. If they sell rights to pollute, say, well, society can afford to pollute this much efficiently, so they can divide that up, and who's ever willing to pay the most for it is supposed to lead to the most efficient uses of it. Or they can just charge a tax, and on the use of CO2 EQ, which essentially increases the price at every quantity. So the market externality is in theory removed. But yeah, it decreases allocative efficiency. People don't want that many polluting goods because the cost is too high from the pollution. They want other goods that may have a more benefit, more likely are going to have a less cost in pollution. Greener goods most likely. Okay. So it does not create a positive market externality, and that is what Chiang calls a public good. And Chiang's implication again is that the victims should somehow be paying for what the perpetrators of anthropogenic global climate change are doing to them. So this is blipping in and out. It's probably because I'm pausing it for various reasons from time to time. So actually, most of you got this right. It's kind of an interesting question. Why might a society may not be on the production possibilities curve? If it's in a as if green curve and we're not, then we'd be producing less of the two goods, and to reduce the cost to society that it's paying, and instead have more free time or go off to another production possibility frontier and produce more green goods. Well, even possibly that just means irrationality. Maybe society's irrational; it's not producing where it could. Other things equal. Uh, Increase savings over time, as I mentioned, with savings, you have to actually draw down. If you're producing rockets and cars, and then all of a sudden you decide to produce instead, instead of all of those, some machines that can produce rocket and cars, and you have to produce less rocket and cars. Your production possibility curve moves inward. and then it goes back out further than when you started in the next time period. And this is intertemporal, meaning a change in time period. This is dynamic time model that we're in now, which Chiang kind of smoothed over, but kind of dismissed. But yeah, we may be inside of the curve if we're savings in a saving period because we're producing the machines instead of the stuff. If people like free time more than they do working, then they're not going to work as much. Uh, all of a sudden, if they suddenly like it more than they did free time more than they did previously, then they're not going to work as much, and there's going to be less of both goods. That's all of the above, right? Okay. So if there is free trade, other things being equal, and it's between a wealthy and a poor country, then it's going to bring prices down to home country because less is being paid for labor. Yeah, it's probably going to cause more environmental damage in ACC, both because the world's producing more, most likely, and because the countries that are poor generally don't have the kind of environmental regulations that the home countries do. There's going to be more transportation. There's going to be more, goods going out to other countries and coming in from other countries. Production is going to spread throughout the world more. It means more transportation. And right, if capital leaves, workers need capital. Capital need workers. So if capital goes away, then it's not going to demand as much labor in the country it's leaving, and in the country it goes to, it's going to demand more labor. So, hence the changes in employment and wages in the home and foreign country. So, yeah, causes wages to go down in the foreign country. Kind of covered that. For some reason, yeah, this was not gotten correct as much as I thought it would be. Terms of trade are just the opportunity cost. It's a range of prices between the opportunity costs of both countries. So once you know the opportunity cost, which I've talked about, then of each country, then the terms of trade are just going to be between those two, according to this model. Okay, comparative advantage question. So right, for reasons I've said, Scotland is better at producing. Ireland is better at producing both. So it's comparative advantage. Scotland has comparative advantage in beef. How do we know that? Said this, but quickly, what we have to do is divide the units of beef into the units of potatoes. We have to divide the units of beef into the units of beef to get that down to 1, and then we divide that into the number of potatoes, so we know how much the opportunity cost is for 1 pound of beef. We do that for both countries. The one with the lower opportunity cost in producing that one, the smaller number, has a comparative advantage. The other country just has the comparative advantage in the other. That's how you do it. It's just an algorithm you have to follow. So doing that, Scotland has a comparative advantage in beef, Ireland in potatoes. The opportunity cost of producing 100 pounds of beef in Scotland is 1 potato. So how do we get that? And the example I gave was the reverse of how it's done in the question. We just divide, in this case, potatoes into itself. The number of potatoes into itself, we get 1 into 100,000 is 100. So the opportunity cost of 1 potato is 100 pounds of beef. And in Ireland, we're getting the opportunity cost in terms of potatoes now. So we take a million potatoes, divide it into a million potatoes. We get one potato. The opportunity cost is 200,000 divided, excuse me, a million divided into 200,000, which gives us, 2/10 or 0.2, 0.2. So then that is the opportunity cost, 0.2 or 2 of producing a potato in Ireland. Okay. So therefore, we know that Ireland has a comparative advantage in potatoes, Scotland does in beef. We know that because we know that Scotland has a comparative advantage in producing beef because Scotland does in producing potatoes. I always remember my first econ professor, the first one whose class I finished, the way he'd always say potatoes. In this way, I didn't do it quite right, but it reminds me of him. In fact, it reminds me of the Day of the Dead for the Dia de los Muertos festival at my university. Not this year, but last year. I put a picture of him up, and lo and behold, some stuff I was working on that I talked to him about when he was alive, became like crystal clear to me. Okay, so true and false multiple choice question. So I'm really trying to have you folks get this. I kind of already covered this, so I'm not going to again. Obviously A is correct, and the reasoning is right there in the question. Okay, you can research this on your own, look it up. I'll give you a little bit more time here to just read this. You can always pause this screen here too if you want. Okay, I think we talked about this first one enough. We get it. So let's move on. Okay. Yeah, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Just kind of really wanting you folks to get this. Yeah, interesting. Though the Trump campaign doesn't really accept global climate change, he did make the point, Vance did, that if you do, restricting trade would be better for it. And that's true. I mean, definitely in forms of domestic policy, Trump may not do as well, but it's also true that the left is just like as the Democratic Party leadership just does not, it has this neoliberal, which is like this pro-business economic philosophy belief in free trade, and they just kind of flout the cost of it. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Here we are, trying to have this Inflation Reduction Act, which is going to like reduce global climate change at best like 0.25%. Excuse me, 0.25 degrees Fahrenheit, not even Celsius. Do very little. Much of this is because the rest of the world is creating much of this, and it's being supported by the West, what they call exporting dirty production. So we're buying stuff from them, and that's driving their creating anthropogenic global climate change. Well, we're buying it, yet the Democratic Party isn't really interested in anything about that. It's actually an interesting story. I was seeing the Rice Tremonti House in Independence. A few sites I've actually seen in Kansas City, and the docent there was talking about how it's been rebuilt, being rebuilt. I don't quite remember, but he's like, "Oh, that Trump, like because of him, we're paying twice as much for lumber. This Canadian lumber costs twice as much because of his import quotas." And I'm thinking, unless you're a tree, so good example of how this restrictive trade policy that Trump advanced, that Trump's going to introduce, is in itself, really good for the environment. Other things equal, ironically, and of course, when Trump was president, he kind of dropped the ball so hard on COVID that we had to have these massive restrictions, which actually finally drew down, reduced global climate, emissions, CO2 equivalent emissions, which is global gas emissions, by 7% globally. And it's like we finally met even the most minimal of UN emissions reductions targets for the first time. Animals started coming back again in my climate class. Someone had posted an article about that because of human activity being so reduced. It was great for the earth. So I was telling a macro econ teacher, I was like, so I was telling him the story, and it was like, I was interpreting what had happened, and it's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He's like, no, it's like the road to heaven is paved with bad intentions. So there you go. Not making any forecasts about the next 4 years or whatever. Um, One can only hope. But yeah, some funny irony there. At least seen from a certain perspective. The funny part, anyhow. So, yeah, weird wording here. Also, absolute advantage. Also, comparative advantage. What's that? Yeah, the system. I have no idea. Let me have repeat words for the match, and all of a sudden it stopped doing that. So I had to phrase it differently in order to do the question. Again, we've talked about this so much. Just very simple here. If one country produces both better, it's comparative advantage. If they each produce one better than the other, it's absolute advantage. Yeah, okay. I'm not going to talk about this anymore for the comparative advantage. Um, yep, super easy. Bam, it's right there in Xiong. He lists these uh, arguments against free trade. Okay, interesting. Little box brought back some memories. Is really nice. Global trade shops from China. Uh, Sorry, from the global trade is interrupted by Chinese New Year. Um, why? Yeah, A, right? That's in Chiang. B is in Chiang. C is something I added because that Chiang didn't talk about. Economists generally tend to dismiss stuff like this. It's more the purview of institutional economics, but they shouldn't because obviously culture has an effect on both productivity and utility, a huge one, especially the latter. Um, Though I will say that if you see the film American Factory, which I'd recommend, they have a scene of the Chinese workers at work. It'd blow your mind just seeing that. I'm not going to try to explain it, but you know that's a case of capital moving into the United States from China. It's kind of cooler because when I lived in Dayton, I was at this community college there, and they're just like, as a student, and they're just like going on and on about, oh, this Chinese auto glass company's coming in, you can all get jobs there and everything. And they actually made a documentary about sort of what happened. Ironic. It's also interesting if you're interested in this sort of thing. I guess that's kind of a tautology, but you might watch the movie Gung Ho. So American Factory, it was on Netflix, probably still is. I don't know. Gung Ho, you'd have to just Google it, and it'll tell you, you can watch it. Uh, the former is a documentary. The latter is a work of fiction, but there are some surprising similarities between them. Um, Actually, this last one, D, you have to emphasize. You kind of have to look at as a group. It's kind of an ironic question because as a group, they they probably won't make more unless they have some really wealthy relatives that aren't working. But that's not going to be enough uh, to be a reason for them to celebrate Spring Festival instead of working. Um, but they're not as a group really making any more money, other things being equal, because they're not working. However, the way the Chinese celebrate Chinese New Year is by giving money to each other, which economists think is the most efficient way to give gifts. They're like, you shouldn't give gifts, you should give money. Only an agent knows what they most want. Now there's some problems with that. See above statement about culture and institutions, but that is so as individuals, if they're kids, the parents, are giving money to them, then um, individual workers will make more money, or make money. I don't know if it's more than they make working. It well could be. So there's a lot of money on an individual basis to be made. Uh, there might be a transfer of income from the retired non-working group to the workers. However, I would still count them in the group of workers because that's where the money was made. I guess there might be an argument that they're getting government transfers and that's going to the workers, or that because they're a past group, they're actually increasing the wealth of workers. But generally, they're not going to make more money, than getting money individually than collectively. If you really want to challenge me on the logic of this question, feel free. We can talk about it. Maybe you could get a point for it. So price dumping. Yeah, the point here is that firms don't price dump per se. Well, actually, well, I mean, the definition of price dumping is that firms charge lower prices so they can knock other firms out of business, and then take their business away because the cost of reforming businesses are high. There's some interesting things about price dumping. However, like Amazon.com, they make money with Amazon Web Services, which is probably one of the reasons Netflix does so much better than some of the other streaming services at streaming, because they are using Amazon Web Services. But as far as the stuff they sell to consumers, like goods and services, they do that at a loss. And we were talking about this in an econ class once, and it's just kind of like the guys like, well, maybe they're going to eventually do price dumping, but they're not. That's not what they're trying to do. I seriously doubt that. They just have non-profit motives. I mean, they're basically operating at a loss because who's ever running it, and I don't really keep up on that, so you probably know better than me. Just wants to take over the market. Maybe it's ego. Maybe this person is just an altruist. But yeah, they are actually charging less than they're making, and it's not price dumping in that they're not trying to drive other firms out of business to then jack up the prices. They may be trying to drive other firms out of business, but that's not why they're doing it. Mini car company in Britain, huge car company, biggest selling car company in the 60s, at least part of it. Same thing. They were selling minis for less than it cost to produce. Now, it was a little different with them. They thought that people were going to buy extras and stuff, and that would make it up, but they didn't. So, yeah. Lastly, there's an episode of The Office where Michael leaves the office and forms his own business, and effectively he was price dumping. They were undercutting Dunder Mifflin by charging less, and it was really hurting them. And I didn't drive them out of business. And Michael's firm was about to, but wasn't going to be able to do that much longer. But he did get advantages from Dunder Mifflin to close down. So it was ultimately to his benefit to sell at a lower price than you're earning as a strategy. And it ended up. It was kind of through his foolish business practices. I don't think he was planning it, but it ended up. I think he got his job back and he got paid better. I assume that trumped whatever it was he lost in the price dumping. So yeah. Free trade zones. Did not know what these were myself really until I read this in Xiong. Pretty simple actually. They bring in capital by lowering, by basically getting rid of tariffs on importing capital. It kind of makes sense to reduce those and then charge tariffs on goods coming in, but not capital. Although, well, how much governments have done that is an interesting question. But tariffs towards not, as opposed to not. I mean, obviously with the whole free trade thing, there may be advantages in lowering tariffs, at least if it's not unilateral. So I also learned, if I assume this is correct, that a lot of free trade zones are in the United States, and that it's he that's brought in as much capital as has gone out, pretty much, or at least kept as many jobs. Obviously, it's not a barrier to free trade. It lowers tariffs, brings capital in. They don't only exist in relatively wealthy countries. Uh, in one of the boxes, in the box that he talks about this, he talks about Costa Rica. I was there a few years ago actually. I remember, there was a red-eyed tree frog and a glass frog, which is like kind of transparent, and the guide said they both looked, very healthy, which is a sign of a healthy ecosystem. Really hope it stays that way. Um, yeah. Okay. It's pretty much all in the book. Didn't add too much to that. Um, so this environmental Kuznets curve thing, I wrote about this. You needed to read the supplemental reading to get this. Chiang is, sort of touting this as this great argument for not having to worry about the environment when poorer countries have lax environmental regulations. The argument is that when a country is poor, as it grows its GDP, it will be destructive of the environment, but then after a period, it'll be even better. Now, first thing I'll say is that, like, in anthropogenic global climate change, they basically turn around and say, like, the opposite. Well, we can't, part of the reason for not doing anything about global climate change is that it will overburden current generations, even though it harms other ones. But all of a sudden, this environmental Kuznets curve argument, they don't care that it's harming current generations if it'll make others better off. So it's kind of like in the anthropogenic global climate change argument, they're saying that, oh, we can't overburden current generations, even though that would make future generations better off. Then all of a sudden, with this EKC, the argument is that we, you know, it's okay to harm current generations because it'll make future generations better off. So, and that's one of the arguments here. Uh, the short run cost can be catastrophic. Like 8 million Chinese at least had died in China from the pollution created by it, and it is getting better. But that leads to the other problem. This study done by Card and Kruger, as I think I mentioned, Kruger killed himself. He also did the minimum wage study that I posted. He was a co-author in that, and in this the study that was the foundational one that kind of introduced the environmental Kuznets curve, though it was not the paper. The name was not brought up in the paper. Others, I think, came up with it. Oh, and by the way, the Kuznets curve is this idea that we don't need to worry about income equality if GDP is growing, because as GDP grows, equality it'll go down for a while and then it'll increase. So it's like the environment. It'll get worse for a while and then it'll get better. Now, the problem here is that this curve was introduced based on studies that were entirely on local pollutants, in-your-face pollutants, water pollution, air pollution, things that as soon as people had enough money, they wanted to get rid of. I mean, they had an incentive to get rid of because it was harming them personally. But the way that Grossman and Kruger, the authors, phrased the conclusion, they made that clear that it was only these local pollutants and may not affect others. But then they went on to make this weird statement. It wasn't technically incorrect, but it highly implied by thrashing environmentalists as not getting it. The water and air pollution being only one of their concerns, that all of their concerns would be were unfounded because of this environmental Kuznets curve study, implying that it could be extended beyond what any evidence was found for. And since then, there's a lot of evidence on things that aren't in your face, like global climate change, deforestation, animal species disappearing, And at best there's very mixed results. I mean, I fundamentally I think the literature would strongly suggest that it is only the case that the environmental Kuznets curve can be said to be true universally or even primarily for these local pollutants, which is consistent with the theory of it. You know, in the economic in microeconomics, humans are what they call Homo economicus, which means that they're only interested in improving their own welfare. So of course, if the environmental damage is something affecting them personally, then as they get more wealth, it's sort of like a normal good. Reducing it is. So they'll start reducing it, but that incentive to get rid of those local pollutants does not extend to ones that are not local, that are not in their face. It does not affect them personally, like anthropogenic global climate change, which horribly affects future generations, species loss, forestation loss. So it's founded on false theoretical concepts, and empirically, it is not played out, to be the case, at least to a degree of sufficiency that we can characterize it as the correct theory. And it was taken as carte blanche to destroy the Earth, which is obviously getting destroyed at a much greater rate than it's being healed. And even if it were true that once it was healed, um, I mean, once people were wealthier, they'd start caring more about the environment. I mean, a lot of stuff is gone forever. So that's one of the other things that be here that are in this question. So it's not a valid. The environmental Cousins curve is not valid, and it's led to massive environmental destruction based on a misinterpretation of the paper that was suggested by it very unethically, I might add, and unprofessionally. Not objective science here, selling. It was specifically, in fact, it was the title was like the North American Free Trade Agreement was propagandizing NAFTA under Clinton, and then the WTO and so forth. Very persuasive in harpooning the environmental attack on free trade. Ironically, or maybe it's not. Yeah, I think there may be a reason for this. Like that first paper I had you read, it made an extra credit about needing microeconomics and macroeconomics, you need restrictions, and then all this stuff that about this kind of physics stuff, which was I didn't like that part of that article. How we're gonna, I don't know, the second law of thermodynamics, which they've actually in itself, it's pretty much starting to be doubted, and it's not true, and they're basically starting to finally understand that, but it definitely doesn't apply to economics. The point being, though, this was an article, talking about how we needed restrictions on growth, and then like a year later, maybe I think it was even the same year, maybe like this EKC, in effect, article comes out, this Grossman Kruger one, saying, no, we don't need to worry about economic growth because it'll turn around and heal itself later, which it, can't do, has a lot of short term costs, and, doesn't do enough to make it true. Very high costs, you know, from its being wrong. I mean, you say, oh, well, we don't know yet because their income isn't high enough as it's disappearing. But they suggest this income limit that countries have crossed, like Mexico, for example, at least in Mexico, they were supposed to be turning around and helping their environment, but they still just kept destroying their forests. And now there's only like Chiapas, that magical rainforest down there. There's only like a little national park left, biosphere reserve or something. So always nice to end on a good note. Good luck on the midterm. Hope you've enjoyed this midterm review.